So you and a bunch of friends have a group project due. And it's due a few weeks from now, so you procrastinate and procrastinate and procrastinate until you realize this is the day before the project is due. So you call each other up, and the first thing out of your mouths is, just kill me now. This is a fairly common statement, but why? Why is it that we as a society have devalued the pain associated with death so much so that we would rather have all that pain instead of facing what is, in the grand scheme of things, a small, trivial matter? The reason is something I like to call the romanticization of pain. So what is this? To romanticize something, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, is to make something sound better than it really is. So to romanticize pain would be to make pain sound better than it really is. If that's a strange concept to you, that's because it is. It's really unthinkable that we as a society would want to romanticize something as painful as, well, pain. But we do, and we do it a lot. We do it through three ways. The first is a constant competition to be the worst off. The second, in our vernacular and speech. And third, in our misuse of clinical mental health terms. Let's start with the first one, the competition to be the worst off. So if you ask any group of people who are older than 14 years old, they will tell you where there is a gathering of students, you will hear one of the following complaints. Either A, they have an abysmally small amount of sleep. B, they have mountains of work to do. Or C, they have lots of unneeded pressure from their parents, their peers, their teachers, basically everyone they know. And after that, there will be a cacophony of noise where people say, me too, and here's my tale of suffering. And we do this for a few reasons, mainly because we're trying to compete to have the worst life circumstances. This is okay when we talk about our problems, but not so much when we compete, because what happens is that people start to make up claims that aren't true about their lives to make it seem like their lives are worse than they actually are. And that's really odd, right? But we do it anyway, and you'll see why in a minute. So if you put this on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is no pain and 10 is a heck of a lot of pain, and your life is a 0, normal. It's perfectly fine, there's nothing wrong with your life, it's pain-free. That's great, right? Except to join these conversations, you keep saying your life is a 5, when it isn't. And after a while you associate the number 5 with the pain of a 0. And that diminishes the amount of pain that you think should be given to, diminishes the amount of attention that should be given to a life that's anywhere between 0 and 5. Because after a while, 5 feels like a 0, and 5 doesn't feel that bad, right? So what happens is when people tell you their lives are somewhere between 0 and 5, you don't think it's worth that much attention, because to you, 5 is fine. So you dismiss their problems, and that can cause serious issues in your relationships. This is kind of like saying sorry too often. If you say sorry when you genuinely mean it, then sorry has meaning to you. But if you say sorry at the end of every other sentence for no particular reason, what happens is sorry loses its value. And when other people tell you they are sorry, you don't really care because it doesn't hold any inherent value to you anymore. I need to stress here that talking about your problems is perfectly all right. It is an easy, normal, and quick way to get support from a large group of people because you all go through the same problems. There's a sense of camaraderie that we always chase after. And that's okay. But the problem here is when you lie about your problems to join this group, you create a lot of other issues that maybe you haven't thought about, because all you're focused on is, I want to join this group because it means that I belong to somewhere. Part of the reason we do this is because of validation. We as a society love validation. If I were to be sad because I was splashed by a car, but the person next to me was sad because they just lost a family member, it would make more sense for all the attention and the support to go to them because they have suffered a larger loss and they need more support. They will receive more validation for their suffering because it is more needed there. The problem here is that society also uses validation as a reward. So if you win a race, you get a gold medal. That's validation. This is exacerbated by social media, because social media is designed in a way that we start to be conditioned into competing to be the most of something in order to receive validation. So for example, if you were to post something that was the most funny, the most pretty, the most cute, you would get the most likes, the most validation for your posts or whatever you put up. But the problem is that people start moving that into social life as well. So you compete to have the worst life, the saddest life, the worst tales. Because this means that people will give you more sympathy and more support, and you receive more validation, which you so desperately crave. So obviously, the competition has some issues, because talking about your problems is perfectly fine, but when you start to lie about them, you start to deceive the people you care about. And that can cause severe issues with your own relationships. I'll illustrate this by telling you a story. So this is about my friend, who's called Bob. Bob lives for this constant competition to be the worst off. Bob's the kind of guy where if I were to say I have a cold, he says, I have a pneumonia. If I say I have dislocated my shoulder, Bob has broken his entire leg. Bob is also the person where if you were to drop a crumb, he will then decide he wants to drop his entire sandwich. This is because of the romanticization of pain means that Bob trivializes things, and he competes to be the worst off all the time. And at this point, nobody wants to talk to Bob anymore, right? Because there's no point trying to talk to someone or get sympathy from someone who isn't bothered to empathize with you. Because he takes everything that you're going through and diminishes it, puts it in a small box and throws it away. And that can be really annoying for us, because why would you want to talk to Bob anymore? But also because this would be really sad for Bob. Because Bob starts to push people away without realizing he's doing it. Because he's constantly chasing after their attention and their sympathy. But he doesn't realize this is also pushing people away. And that can be really bad on our relationships. Because you start to isolate yourself from the rest of society. So this brings me on to the second manifestation of the romanticization of pain in our vernacular and speech. This is typically where people start to face things that they are not really comfortable doing or they are embarrassed about. So for example, I will die giving a recorded TED Talk to a large group of people because I don't like public speaking. This is supported by a group of psychologists, Bark, Chen, and Burrows. They did a study in 1996 that has pretty good evidence to support this. So what they had was a bunch of participants play word games, and participants were either, depending on the words they got in the game, primed to be rude, polite, or neutral, the neutral being the control group. Then participants were asked to look for the experimenter, who's in the next room, where they walked in and they'll find the experimenter talking to an actor, who we will call a confederate. What happens here is that the participants walk in, and without them realizing it, the experimenter is recording whether they are going to interrupt the conversation or not. What they found was that people who were primed to be rude were much more likely to interrupt than the neutral group, the control group. And people primed to be polite were much less likely to interrupt than the control group. What does this mean? This means that what you believe has an impact on what you do. Because what you believe primes your brain, and that priming will have manifestations in your actions. So let's go back to my friend Bob. Bob has a history test. He says, studying for the history test will make me depressed. It depresses me, I hate it. And what Bob means is not so much that he's going to get depression from the history test, but that he's going to do badly. And this metaphorical meaning will trigger a negative feedback loop. So what happens? Bob thinks, I'm not going to do well, so I'm not going to study. It doesn't matter, I'm going to fail anyway. So Bob doesn't study. And as a student, I think we all realize that when you don't study, you fail. And this is what happens to Bob. He fails. But because Bob is human, like us all, he is prone to confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the idea where you disregard things that don't fit with your worldview and only remember the things that do. So in this case, Bob is going to ignore the fact that he didn't study, and he's just going to focus on the fact that he failed. So Bob gets his results back, looks at them and goes, I told you so. And that restarts the negative feedback loop, because this emphasizes the fact that he thinks he's bad at history. So the next history test, he's like, oh, I failed last time, I'm going to fail again, so I'm not going to study again. And it starts it again, and again, and again. Which obviously has really bad impacts on his history grades, right? But this can all be stopped if he were to, in the first place, not romanticize pain. If he hadn't said that the history test would depress him, then he wouldn't start this negative feedback loop that keeps going on in cycles. So before this talk, I asked some of my friends in various countries to help me compile some evidence. I asked them to help me observe the number of times they heard some things. One of them is suicidal terms. what we found was in America, things like "I want to die," sentences like that are heard about 40 times a week. 40 times a week is a really large amount of times. That's incredibly high. But this isn't just an American problem, see. Because here you have US at 40 times a week, Taiwan at 49, and Singapore at 50 times a week. That's far too high. Because every time this is done, you could be hurting someone who's genuinely suicidal. Because what you're suggesting is that their pain is on the same level, is on par with whatever trivial matter you're misusing the suicidal terms for. You're suggesting that everything they feel, all the suffering, all the hurt, is the same as, for example, studying for a history test. And it's not. And that really hurts people because it suggests that everything they go through is worth very, very little. So I know there's hope because of another observation I made. I asked some of my friends in primary school, grades 1 to 6, to do the same thing. And they told me, across all countries, that the number of times they heard people misuse terms related to suicide was absolutely none. None at all. I thought that was a fluke, because it was the same in all the countries I asked my friends to survey. So I asked them to do it again for a longer period of time, this time 3 months. And it was the same result. Nobody said it. No one at all. This is a little bit sad because it suggests that when we are younger, we know better than to misuse terms that could hurt other people. And when we are older, we choose to use them anyway. But it's also pretty good because this means that we are aware of what we say. And we can make a change because these small children, they know better than to say things that could hurt people. They know how to control what they say. They know how to pick words that still emphasize what they're saying, but don't actually hurt other people around them. So the question now is, what do they say? They say things like, "I'm so stressed," and "This homework sucks." And they wish for longer break times, and nicer food at lunch, and less homework. But they always identify what makes them sad and talk about that instead of talking about something that isn't real and isn't real for them. Not to say isn't real for them. Sorry. So this brings the question, and a question I would like to ask you all is that, why is it that these small children are able to do this and we are not? Are we not older and therefore wiser? The challenge I would like to pose to you today is, if they can do it, why can't we? So this brings me on to the third manifestation of the romanticization of pain, and that is through our misuse of mental health terms. This one's particularly significant and particularly hurtful for other people. So in the same way that we gathered the results earlier, I also asked my friends to gather it for OCD, for PTSD, autism, and depression across these countries. I've highlighted the ones that are larger numbers, and I'm sure you've realized that not every country in the world is on the board. Also, I'm sure you've realized by now, this is a problem that doesn't just impact these countries. It's not a localized problem, but rather an international one. This is something that affects us all. And because it affects us all, it's something that all of us have a responsibility to mitigate against. For comparison, Euromonitor International estimates the average person showers 6 times a week. The fact that such a small, meaningless task that we do without thinking almost every day is done less than the number of times we hear these terms being misused is kind of shocking. Because it suggests that we misuse these terms more often than we do small, meaningless things like shower. And every time these terms are misused, there's a potential for someone to get hurt. And that kind of suggests that we should mitigate against these more. We should be more mindful and more aware. I have a friend who, when I first met her in one of my previous schools, was the happiest person I knew. And that's saying something, because I know a lot of happy people. She was cheerful and bubbly and smart and kind, and she has autism. And she did not realize when she first entered the school, but the word autism had begun to be used as an insult. And that was really bad, because it was thrown around with the same frequency that you would say hello. It was said so frequently, and there was this constant barrage on her of people misusing the term to mean something that suggested she was worth nothing. And it diminished her self-confidence and her will to be seen in public. Because everywhere she went, there would just be people constantly reminding her of how they thought she was worth nothing. at the point in time, I didn't understand why people would so obviously continue to misuse the term when it was impacting her so badly, when you could so obviously see her confidence being crushed under the boots of people who didn't realize they were doing it. But now I do. And the reason why they do this is because of the romanticization of pain. Because you see, to them, the pain associated with being insulted by something she could not help having was trivialized. And to them, it didn't mean much, but to her, it did. So when they misused the term, thinking that it wouldn't be that much of an impact, and it had a large impact anyway, people got hurt. And this happens all over the world, with all sorts of mental disorders, all the time. And this kind of hurt really shouldn't be existing in a society like this. So you might say, hang on a minute, I only say these things a handful of times, so I'm in the right, nothing's wrong with me. To that, I would like to say, you are wrong. You're wrong because misusing mental health terms is like being slapped. Regardless of whether you are slapped once or 50 times, it still hurts. And for that reason, we should not be misusing these mental health terms with the same frequency that we do. However, there's a bright side. The bright side is that these manifestations of the romanticization of pain that I've mentioned earlier can be fixed. It can be fixed with really small, simple solutions. The first being to think before you speak. If you don't say something to potentially hurt someone, they aren't hurt. So if you were to think about what you were saying and realize that what you say could hurt someone and you don't say it, then you prevent the problem before it starts. The second, don't lie about your situation to fuel the competition for the worst circumstances. You can offer other things like sympathy and advice and, of course, chocolate, because chocolate helps everything. So don't lie, because there are other ways to join that conversation and feel the same sense of camaraderie with your friends without having to make up things about your situation that detracts from what other people are feeling. There are ways to join these conversations without making it seem like you kind of always have the worst life. Your friends will understand that sometimes your life is great. They will be fine with it. Don't worry. So the last solution is to be an example. Because people can change. And it's okay if you're not perfect. And it's okay if you slip up sometimes, because the fact that you try is inspiring. Because it's the trying that means that you are striving towards an ideal. And it's the striving that inspires groups of people, not so much the perfection. It is okay if you don't inspire a large amount of people. It is okay if you only inspire a handful of people. And it's okay if you only inspire one person. And it's perfectly all right if that one person is you. Because for every person that tries to make a change is another person who is trying to make this society a safer, happier, more accepting place for other people. And that is what really matters. Thank you.